some background on markers and reinforcement systems. And then I think where I want to go with this is sort of what happens when we, hi, Michelle, when we kind of mess up our markers and reinforcement systems and sort of what the potential risk is with that. Because I think that's sometimes what gets missed is like, why does it matter? When we say like, oh, teach your reinforcement system before you train, why do we do that? Michelle, is there anything, I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there anything specific you wanted to talk about, or do you want me to just ramble about markers and reinforcement systems and clarity? If there's anything y'all want to chat about, you can type in there. Obviously, feel free to interrupt me as I'm talking about this stuff too, but I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. This is your time. So I'll kind of give just like the brief background. I know I have sent multiple articles on this topic out, but I figure we'll just kind of level set so that we're on the same page, and then we'll kind of veer off and see where it goes. So markers, I am sure y'all have heard markers talked about a million times. You very often hear people talk about markers like the click in clicker training, or like yes, right? Those are examples of markers, and they get described in a range of different ways, kind of depending on probably the context and who's choosing to do, who's doing the describing and who the audience is. Very often you'll hear people say, oh, they tell the dog that they did the right thing. And they do that, but that's probably the most kind of rudimentary way you could talk about them, because it doesn't really tell you what you need to do in order to use a marker effectively, other than use it at the time when your dog did the thing that you would like to see more of. You also hear people describe them as conditioned reinforcers, right, or secondary reinforcers, and they are that. Those are basically reinforcers that have to be learned. A primary reinforcer is something that no prior experience with that stimulus has to have occurred in order for it to be reinforcing, right? Just straight into the world, the contact with that reinforcer is innately going to be reinforcing. These are often going to be like the things that we physiologically need: food, water. Most reinforcers out there that we're coming into contact with are learned. They're secondary or conditioned reinforcers. And those secondary reinforcers are learned through a very close pairing with either a primary reinforcer or another strong pre-existing secondary reinforcer. So the pairing that happens is, you click or you mark, you say yes, and a treat follows it, or some reinforcer. It could be a ball toss if a ball toss is a really strong reinforcer for your dog. But that repeated association, that repeated pairing means that the marker itself becomes a conditioned reinforcer. Where I sometimes struggle with when we describe it only as this is that I think sometimes it leads people to think that, great, I'll just mark. And so I have interacted with so many people who are doing a wonderful job of like using the marker at the right time. They're saying yes at brilliant moments. But they're not following it up with a reinforcer. And I think you run into the same issue when you describe the marker in the way that I did in that first description, where you told the dog that they did the right thing, right? Yes, good job, right? And so people just sometimes go with, yes, good job, because they didn't get the full kind of definition of what a marker is. And so anytime we're using a marker, we should follow it up with the reinforcer that it's supposed to predict. I do like the description of a marker as a bridge. I think that's kind of an important addition to the way we think about it, because there is inherently going to be lag time between the very specific behavior that a dog does and our ability to deliver a reinforcer. Like we can't deliver it fast enough. So behavior is going to happen between the specific behavior that you're trying to increase and the delivery of the reinforcer. And so without some way to say, boom, connect this behavior to this reinforcer, it's unclear which behavior is actually going to get strengthened. Um, and so the marker allows us to basically very specifically and precisely build behavior. You could certainly get away with training, especially certain types of behaviors more so than others, right? You would have a really hard time shaping a complex behavior like, you know, uh, my poor brain right now, like grabbing a drink from the fridge, right? Like that, you would need to so thinly slice some of those behaviors. You'd probably chain that anyway, but you would still have to thinly slice a lot of those behaviors, and you would need precision in that. Um, Even something like, like lifting a back leg, right? You need very precisely to be able to mark weight shifts and things like that. Without that, you're going to have a lot more frustration. um, uh, anyway, so I think that is a very helpful kind of addition in the way that we think about that, is that it's a bridge connecting the reinforcer to the very specific behavior we're trying to strengthen. Um, the piece that I think is I'm biased these days because like, I'm for some reason very interested in antecedents, but um, uh, that I find really helpful and sort of enriching to the overall definition of a marker is that a marker is a cue. And I think because so often we are so focused on the fact that the marker happens after the behavior that we're trying to reinforce, um, we're only thinking about its kind of reinforcing properties, its association with the reinforcer, but it has cueing property too. So when you start to understand that the marker is basically telling your dog that some reinforcer is now available, contingent upon doing some other behavior. And it's really easy to take that for granted because often our dogs just kind of figure out what to do, right? Like a hand extends with a treat and they figure out to come and get it. But I'll sort of get into where we can, where this can get us into trouble when we take this for granted. Um, so anyway, it has these cueing properties that's basically the same way that when you say sit, your dog learns, if I put my butt on the ground, human will deliver a treat. Um, the same thing happens when you say yes. Dog has learned yes means that if I uh, stand still and lower my head and grab the treat, I'll have a treat in my mouth. Um, it's I'm going to make it slightly more complicated in a second when I talk about reinforcement systems, but that's sort of the rudimentary piece of this. And I think the reason that this matters so much is because um, if we think about it like a cue, we are a little bit less likely to take it for granted, right? Markers are so powerful in how we can teach a lot of behaviors out in the world. Like if we have the ability to have our dogs respond to markers, we can turn almost any cue essentially into a recall cue, right? To turn and orient to us. Um, but we have to respect the fact that the marker is itself a cue that has to be taught and then generalized. And without sort of focusing on that, it's very easy to go out into the world and think that you can just use that marker anywhere and get a response because look, my dog knows how to take a treat. Um, but you kind of have to train it the same way you would train anything else. And then the sort of I'm going to jump kind of to reinforcement systems, um, and then kind of talk about the sort of ambiguity and clarity. And I'll give you some examples. I don't know if you saw the post I recently, I think it was 2 days, 3 days ago, maybe, where I was playing with Otis. Well, give me a second, I'll come back to that. But I'll highlight what I did wrong and why I said I should have stopped, basically taught him a reinforcement system and then come back because I risked frustrating the hell out of him. Um, so in a reinforcement system, this is a term that I am most familiar with from Jesus and Mary Hunter. But it's basically this kind of back and forth chain between dog and person that ends in the reinforcement. And so it's looking at, I'll give you an example of, let's pick something super simple like a click and a treat. If we were to look at at that as a reinforcement system, you have the person clicking. What should the dog do when they hear the click? Okay. They stand still in front of person. Okay. That now is a cue for, we'll just use me to stick hand in bag. Okay. What is that a cue for the dog to do? Dog should continue to stand still. And that may sound like a given, but many dogs will come stick their head in your treat bag when your hand goes in here, right? So it's very clear to them that in order to progress in this chain, you stand still. Now my hand comes out like this. Now dog's face comes down, grabs treat. It's this back and forth that ends in the actual reinforcement, but there's all of these behaviors that are occurring on both sides where one individual's behavior is the cue for the other individual's behavior, but all along the way, it's very clear for the dog. There are a lot of dogs who get really frustrated is a bit of a label, but you'll see them, jumping up, mugging hands or trying to get in treat bags. And there's not some like flaw with the dog. It's just that those behaviors of the person are cueing those behaviors of the dog. There probably is some degree of what we would call frustration. But a lot of times we can solve that by teaching very clearly exactly what that back and forth should be. There's obviously far more complex reinforcement systems where it becomes, I think, more obvious that you would have to teach it ahead of time. I think it's a little bit easier to take some of the other ones for granted. For example, like one of the ones that I might use, if I'm going to have a treat jar that's far away from me when I'm training, I would tell my dog ahead of time, I teach the dog ahead of time that in this session, when I mark, you're going to follow me. You're going to walk with me, stand in front of me while I reach in. I'm going to hand a treat to you. So that is not a point of frustration. That sort of reinforcement system gets taught first. And I think when we train well, we teach those things ahead of doing an actual training session. We sort of, unless we're doing very simple, like, to be honest, I still